Chapter 431, Good Hands. Chris' point of view. Location, Montreal. I must admit, watching those things work is quite freaky, I said as the golems went about their work. There was an unnaturalness to them that made it hard to look away from, yet eye-catching nonetheless. The ones made to appear more human-like were only worse. Abigail chuckled. Yes, they are strange, but they do good work. Aye, that they do, I muttered. Just looking at the growing mountain of rock and dirt was enough to tell me that much. Most importantly, they didn't tire as normal people did. Ever since setting them to the task, the group of goalmancers had been at it like clockwork. Without any management required, too. They arranged themselves into a rotation of sorts, where when one ran out of mana or became too mentally fatigued, the next one stepped in seamlessly. As the woman had stated, some were better at digging than others, but they all got the job done and got it done quickly. We were even ahead of schedule, and I had to question if our reinforcements from Fort Hope would arrive in time before the wall started to crumble. I had told Ashton to call on his forces once the battle was finished in Ottawa, and it had only been 2 months since then. They were still a few weeks out. The goalmancers had made better time getting here from Frostbound than expected. Likely because they didn't have to rely on supply wagons as we did, and the trip was made much shorter because of it. Fort Hope's forces, though, didn't have that same luxury, and while being closer, would arrive later. They had also needed some time to muster, organize, and prepare to march across the country, while the goalmancers had already been prepared. There was a loud series of thrums as the siege weapons unloaded on the city that I almost didn't hear anymore. It had happened enough times my ears naturally tuned it out. I doubted it would amount to much damage, but we were bombarding the city anyway. Besides damage, there were a few reasons to do so. Cover fire, mainly so they didn't try to shoot back. It helped clear the tops of the walls so that there were fewer watchers. It also forced them to either do something about the boulders or allow them to land. The biggest reason was that they didn't know what we were doing and assumed that we were content to just bombard them. The tunnel was well hidden on the backside of our camp behind lines of tents and other supplies to provide cover. The dirt extracted was piled away and out of sight as well. I doubted that our deception would last forever, but we still tried at least. All it would take is one earth mage in the city to feel us digging, and the game would be up. Our hope was to delay that as long as possible. It would give them less time to prepare and less of an opportunity to potentially come up with countermeasures. I still can't believe you kept this from me, I said as I looked at my sister from the side. I hardly did anything like that. I introduced you to Alyssa years ago. You did. Confusion colored my face, but my memory didn't help. I don't remember you doing that. It was right after Lakeshore. She turned to look at me. You fought her golem, I do believe. Well, not fought, but took a punch from. I'm surprised you don't remember. Her eyes felt like they were drilling into me. I pushed the shame and sadness I felt when I tried to remember those times. I don't like remembering those days much. Perhaps that's why. My dismissive tone obviously didn't work on her, but she allowed the comment to pass thankfully. You've seen them during the settlement waves, though, haven't you? She asked. I nodded. Yes, I recall something like these contraptions, but those are always so hectic. There are thousands of people fighting in those. Miles testing out his newest inventions, Gabriel and his new spells, new arrivals that I've never seen before. It's all hard to keep track of, especially in the thick of fighting. Well, Alyssa's group can single-handedly take care of all 3 of the village pylons we have without any outside help. She explained. Village waves weren't as difficult as the ones in Frostbound, but that was still impressive to defend by your lonesome. Are they everything you hoped them to be? How much coin have you funneled into this project exactly? I asked. They are, Chris, and don't act like this is news to you. You read my expense reports every month. I'll admit that their research and development costs aren't small, but it's not like we can't afford it. They've been given less than the amount you threw at the runesmiths in trying to create a bag of holding. She tooted. Hey, those would have been great. Even if all we ended up with were spatially expanded backpacks, that was well worth the expense. I defended. I may have gotten a bit carried away with the project. I'd sunk not only the city's coin into it, but some of my own as well. Well, a lot of my own. It was frustrating, but it wasn't like we were going to get everything perfect on the first try. The attempts alone had been eye-opening and more than helpful in advancing my craft. Not only me, but several others as well. I now knew with certainty that space was just not my affinity. It was sad, but I expected it. Frost was more than enough for me, even if I did wish to teleport one day on my own power. Without the space affinity, not even a smidgen of it, that day would come much later. There were ways to teleport without it, but that only came much later down the line and were available to higher ranks. Like flight, the wind affinity aided in flight, but it was possible without it. It just required more power. Do you know there are talks of portals in the south? Abigail asked evenly, like she wasn't talking about something as groundbreaking as she was. What? I stifled my shout midway, but couldn't keep the alarm from my voice. Portals? How? Who? Were they successful? I hadn't dedicated much attention to outside our walls, so it was a bit surprising to hear of such things. Not that I didn't expect things to advance in other factions, but portals were a rather large jump. Calm down. They're just being theorized and experimented with, she explained. Nothing like you're imagining. All I've heard is the Admiral is spending significant resources on the project. And has he been successful? I asked. It didn't surprise me that it was him who was focused on such research. Somewhat, she answered. There's a rumor that they've created one, but it was small, unstable, and didn't last very long. Not to mention expensive. From what I hear, the mana it took to create makes Gabe's little ritual look like child's play. Huh. I was a bit stupefied. Portals. We're keeping an eye on how it works out, but we don't want to risk antagonizing him by getting caught. Once it's more stable and further along, though. She knowingly eyed me. You want my blessing? Couldn't help but ask. You are the faction leader. This is an action that could have far-reaching consequences. This isn't something I can decide on unilaterally, she said. My mind put a few helpful pieces together, and I looked at Abigail appraisingly. Really looked. How long have you known? There was no way she was just learning of this now. A while, she shrugged. I wanted to tell you, but then everything went to shit. You were gone in the north for so long, and then you stayed in Frostheim only a few days. You fought for Marcus and then Vanessa, and now we're here. There wasn't exactly a whole lot of time to sit down and discuss things. This wasn't a priority either. What else aren't you telling me? Nothing critical. Your focus should be here, not on whispers in the south. I'm handling that, and when things need your attention, I will bring it to you. Her tone was stern as she stared me in the eye. I sighed. You're right. I haven't exactly kept myself abreast of the happenings. No, I'd come back from the north and rushed into one thing after another. The only times I'd really slowed down were when we were sieging cities, and that wasn't exactly the best time to discuss such matters. Oh, to be home again, I muttered. Fine, I continued. But I want a full accounting of everything once all this business is worked out. I vaguely gestured towards the city. So, you're fine with? Yes, do your spying. I hardly doubt anyone else isn't already. I may not be up to date, but I do know when people disappear in my city. I looked at her accusingly. I may not agree, but that does not mean I don't see the value in it. I just don't like it. It was the main reason I hadn't interfered. I knew Abigail was involved, and that was enough to put my mind at ease. Essentially, I was burying my head in the sand, trying to remain ignorant, but that was the way I liked it. Plus, it wasn't like I would be any good at it. I'd never been good at sneaking around. Even when I was a kid, I didn't like how slimy it made me feel. The fact it was in good hands was enough for me. Good, she nodded happily. I honestly didn't want to know how many people we were spying on. Chapter 432, Through, Over, or Into. Chris' point of view. I looked around at the resolute faces filling my tent and could only feel an increasingly common mixture of pride and worry. Pride for everyone's willingness to follow me into battle on the morrow, and worry for everyone's willingness to follow me into battle on the morrow. Worry for the chance that this would be the last time I spoke to one of them, or many of them. So the plan is set. Everyone is in agreement. I posed to the group. We had been strategizing and preparing to take the city for weeks now, but now was the final time that alternatives or alterations would be brought up. When the sun rose tomorrow, we would begin our assault. The lieutenants, captains, and other leaders, along with Abigail and me, had already spent the previous days confirming and solidifying our path forward. Still, it was always good to go over things one last time. If nothing else, then to make sure everyone knew their role. Yes, Elliot had looked over his lieutenants, some too wounded to participate, but were included in planning anyway, and gave his accent. Yes, Hal did the same. Agreed. Gabriel did so for his Order of the Fox. The healers are filled and prepared as we can be, Ashley confirmed. They were always iterating and refining the most up-to-date healing practices and were ready for the assault. I turned toward our newest and youngest member, who was still getting comfortable being the center of attention for so many high-ranked people. Alyssa had held her ground well and was growing into a good leader, but she wasn't as experienced yet. That would change. Even if her role didn't go as well as planned, there were many other things I could see her unit helping with. I wasn't alone either, as Abigail, Elliot, and Hal had all noticed opportunities where their golems would come in handy. Their help in tunneling was just the largest and easiest to see. Their help in setting up fortified camps, the ability to carry supplies, and other labor-intensive tasks alone were worth including. That was without their involvement in combat. We would see how good they were at that soon enough. The young woman gave the map one last look before nodding firmly. Agreed. With that, we were set. All right then, I concluded. Make sure all of you get a good night's rest and tell everyone to prepare as they will. They all gave varying confirmations and began filing out of my tent one after another. I watched them all go with little of the anticipation I had come to expect. There had been so many battles now that I didn't even get the night before jitters. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad one. Abigail gave me a long look, but she too passed through the flaps, leaving me alone in my tent for the first time in what felt like days. There was always one person or another in here needing something, but now there was only silence. I flopped back into my chair with a resigned huff, unwilling to maintain my confident demeanor for no one to see. This war was draining on me, and I couldn't wait until it was over. We weren't even halfway through Canada, yet I already wished for the finish line. Against my will, my eyes went over the battle plan arrayed on the table one more time, even though I'd been through it many times already. We shall see if it's good enough. With a shake of my head, I got up and lay down on my bed. My beloved, cool to the touch, best thing to ever be purchased, bed. It was a risk bringing the treasure along with me, but I feared how weary I'd be without it. It had helped keep the fatigue at bay while also accelerating my normal healing. After getting shot with a fucking ballista in Ottawa, I was glad I had brought it. Its soothing touch helped lull me to sleep, even with the dull worry in the back of my mind. Chris? A voice pulled me from my slumber, but I resisted. Chris? It repeated. It's time. Ugh. I moaned, dragging myself up. Felt like I just closed my eyes. Yet I was being shaken awake all the same. Abigail stood over me and was dressed to impress. Her battle armor fit her well, and the leather was well cared for. There were a few scuffs from the previous battle, but nothing too damaging. It was still dark outside with just the barest hints that the sun would soon be up, a subtle brightening towards the east. I sighed, rubbing at my eyes. She was right. It was time. Breakfast was a quiet affair as we tried to keep our movements and sounds under wraps. I had run out of coffee sometime in between Ottawa and Montreal, and I wouldn't be getting more anytime soon. The trade route to the Golden Isles took over half a year to get there and back. Still, the food was hearty and filling. I made sure not to overeat, along with everyone else. When the time finally came, and the sun was just beginning to show itself, I strapped on my plate with the help of a few aides. Hammer in hand, I walked to the front of our camp where everyone else was waiting. 2 long lines of golems comprised our vanguard, with the warriors lining up directly after them. Alyssa stood next to the largest and most dangerous-looking construct, and she straightened at my approach. "The sappers are ready on your command," she said stiffly. Sleep still clung to her eyes, but she was alert and aware. Similar to how I felt myself. Remember to go hard and go fast, I reminded her. When the walls fall, you charge through the opening and don't stop. Charge through, over, or into whatever awaits us on the other side. Our job is to create space and break the lines. Don't get bogged down in a fight early. Don't fear getting surrounded. Our warriors will fill in behind you. Alyssa nodded. I would still lead, but it was good advice for her and her unit to follow. She wouldn't be charging physically, but their golems would. There was a range limit they had to be aware of, but they wouldn't be close to the front line if everything went right. If it didn't, they would keep a golem as a guard. There would be no 3 prongs of attack this time. No, this was going to be one large and brutal assault. We hoped to catch them off guard, but couldn't guarantee we would. Even if we didn't, we were prepared to sunder a 30-foot section of wall for our entry point. With me, Anders, and the golems prying the shell open, we would get through one way or another. Alyssa. She tried to keep her hands from shaking and her breath steady, but was probably failing dramatically. The others were probably just being nice by not saying anything about it. They had to be. She was scared to death. It was one thing to say something and quite another to follow through and do it. The settlement waves were nothing compared to this. In them, it was her standing on the walls waiting for the attackers to arrive. In them, it was her behind the comfort of defenses. It was her who had the benefit of the high ground from which to control her constructs. Now it was all reversed. She looked up at those tall ramparts of stone and just couldn't imagine charging at them. The very thought stilled her feet and submerged them in lead. The idea itself too daunting to imagine. Yet no one else was acting like this was anything out of the ordinary. She turned her head to the side and saw a man she had heard so many things about. The Lord of Frost. The giant in the north. The Viscount. He stood undaunted in the face of what she saw as an impassable obstacle. He tested his arms and swung his hammer lightly back and forth like he was getting ready for a spar. The plates of his armor scraped against each other with his every motion, yet he seemed unfazed. His previous words of encouragement had only done the opposite. Charge through, over, or into them. Alyssa honestly didn't want to think about that too much. She heard him don his helmet, tightening the straps, completing the look. Soon after, frost swirled, and ice layered over the already thick metal. With everything set, and a look behind to make sure his army was with him, he looked at Alyssa and gave a curt nod. Alyssa let out a shaky breath. Now, she sent the command to her golem to give the signal. It stood in the tunnel beneath the wall with the sappers who stood waiting. Message stones could alert the enemy or get intercepted. Her commands were more subtle. It helped that the golem used wasn't for combat, so it wasn't like her strength was affected in any way. Seconds after, the ground started to shake, and a deep rumble started to spread. Slowly, ever so slowly, the wall she had been staring up at began to sink. The ground at its base gave way and the stones holding up the once impassable obstacle fell. Slow became fast as momentum was gained. The edges of what would collapse easily made themselves known as they stood still while the rest fell away. 25 feet of wall just wasn't supported anymore. With the cat out of the bag, she felt this presence descend on the area, and even if she had been deaf, the command could have been heard. Charge! Her body nearly moved of its own accord, sending her golems forward into a sprint while her unit did the same. It was the first time she had seen the strength of so many constructs active at the same time. Over 200 golems charged forward, but she couldn't help but stare at one of the sole humans leading the way. The icy figure bounded forward with such surety, it was like he was the replaceable construct and the golems were the flesh and blood. She didn't have to wonder about the giant of the North title for long. As with every step, he started to grow. Halfway to the newly created opening, he'd gained 3.5 feet. A veritable giant stomping his way forward with a hammer to match. How the weapon grew, she wasn't sure, but that wasn't at the top of her things to worry about at this moment. No, it was making sure she wouldn't mess the plan up, and her golems were right behind the madman at the front. Commanding so many was difficult, but she had a deft hand with the commands by now. Jason and the rest of her unit followed right behind her. The golems themselves were preceded by Christopher and two other men, one in ice she knew to be Anders, and the other encased in metal she knew to be Elliot. As the dust settled, the insides of the city finally became visible, and she saw soldiers scrambling to fill the gaps. She couldn't hear anything over the thundering of feet and war cries, but the enemy commanders were shoving people into position, and their mouths were moving to yell out commands. The time between the wall's collapse and their charge was mere moments, but already there was a hasty line of men and women filling the hole as best they could. Uneven and unprepared, they stood there to receive the charge. Through, over, or into. Through, over, or into. As the giant of the north threw himself into those hasty lines, she finally saw what those words meant. Through, he didn't even try to swing his hammer fast enough to kill everybody in his way. His momentum and physicality were enough to bowl over any who tried to stop him. Over, the bodies that weren't irreparably crushed by that hammer of his. He stomped over in a bid to force his way deeper in. Death was a mercy, as being trampled in the stampede of what came after was undoubtedly worse. Into, probably the worst of the three. Such size, weight, and speed was like a projectile in its own right, leaving dead and dying things in its wake. Broken lines and broken dreams. Alyssa wanted to hurl, but she commanded her contracts forward all the same. With such an example to look at, it was hard not to understand what her assignment was. She commanded Jax, her pride and joy, the best of her ability, to crush through shields, charge over bodies, and force into whatever soldier stood against her. Her other golems received the same command. Her great works were stained red in seconds, and she would never get the sight out of her head even if she tried. Chapter 433, 2 of 3. Chris' point of view. Location, Montreal. The fighting didn't last long after the walls fell. The entire thing didn't take that long at all, really. I wasn't surprised, but it was still uplifting to have this over and done with so quickly. Not that speed removed or reduced the bloodiness of the battle. No, it did not do that, but it certainly made it feel lighter in a way. Easier to bottle up and put away. Our casualties were next to nothing, which helped matters. Under 100, which was a welcome surprise. Not only did the golems help with that, but catching the enemy off guard did as well. It hadn't gone off perfectly, as they had people standing behind the walls to meet our charge, but they were no match without their fortifications. Alyssa's group lost a few of their constructs, but I had already agreed to pay for anything they lost in the war. I was hoping they didn't cost as much as I thought they did. The young woman herself looked a bit squeamish in the aftermath. Her complexion was pale, paler than normal, and her hands were shaking. She also couldn't stop looking at all the bodies that were being carried out of the city. Usually, we had the living citizens try to identify them so we could ask what their wishes were for the remains. Cremation, burying, or something else. Those who went unclaimed or were unable to be claimed, we burned in a large pyre. We used to bury them, but after learning of death magic and seeing the undead, we switched to cremation. Alyssa watched as body after body was transported, and I could tell that she was beginning to spiral. It was a feeling most in the army had at one point or another. Even the hardiest of stomachs balked eventually. Nothing about my movement was quiet, but she was too focused to hear my heavy footsteps or the soft rubbing of my plate. Even when I came up to her side, she stayed focused ahead. Her face still held traces of blood along with a few splotches on her clothes. She'd seen a few close calls, but was protected well enough from the worst of it. "You should go get yourself cleaned up," I said softly. "Staring at them won't do you any good." She flinched, finally breaking away from her unfocused staring. "How do you do it?" she asked quietly. Her voice seemed so small. "How do you deal with this?" The sad but true answer was that you get used to it. Unfortunately, that wasn't the answer she needed right now, but I also wasn't going to lie to her with honeyed words. Differently. Everyone deals with it differently. Some through drink, some through keeping busy, and some through other ways. It's something humans have gotten good at, I fear. We've been doing it for thousands of years. I said. The long history of man killing each other was long and storied. I wouldn't be surprised if we adapted ways to make it easier on our psyche, as sad as that sounded. Ever since the days of Cain killing Abel, blood was all too often spilled. How do you? You killed more people today than anyone else. Her eyes looked up at me with a hope that broke a small part of me. Hope that I had a magic way to wash her feelings away and make it all better. The second part hurt to be reminded of, though. It was a common enough question I received. I trained the Oathbound often during our campaign, and similar questions had been asked by many others. It never made answering them any easier. I had taken this young woman who had been so vibrant and full of wonder, and crushed it under dark deeds and blood spilled. It was one more thing I had to live with. Slowly, I breathed out deeply, very, very slowly. I turned away from the city and looked toward the untainted wilds of the north. It stays with you. The memories don't just go away, but they do fade. With time, they're replaced with happier times, brighter times. You just have to keep moving forward until that day comes. Probably wasn't the best advice, but it was all I could give her. I didn't have any magic words that would make her feel better. I didn't have a way to make any of them feel better. I pointedly did not bring up the number of levels she had gained. At the start of this, aura detection had her at level 101, and now, after the deed was done, it put her at 105. A respectable jump, but focusing on the level gains was a path to ruin. My own level increased not once, but twice. Name: Christopher Zelensky. Race: D. Human * class. D. Warden of the North. Legendary. Level 132. Profession: D. Adept Runesmith. Epic. Level 113. Affinity. Arctic faction: Frostheim. Leader. Title: Viscount. Strength: 4081. Agility: 1895. Perception: 858. Fortitude: 3413. Endurance: 2193. Vitality: 1382. Intelligence: 783. Wisdom: 1372. Acumen: 742. Free points: 0. Laws: Lesser Law of Ice, Tier 2. Lesser Law of Wind, Tier 2. Body Stage: Body of Copper, Northern Wind Body. Might of the Arctic Body, Mana Heart. Perfect Ignition, Stars of Primordial Frost. Spirit Stage: Anchor Formation. I was only 8 levels away from my next skill. Only 8. In a year and a half, I was a third of the way through D rank. At this rate, I would finish it in 5 years, give or take. A blazing speed by most standards. That was only if I kept this pace, which wasn't possible. Technically it was, but it wasn't a path I wished to go down. The rate I was killing people just wasn't sustainable, nor did I want it to be. The Reservation, Starlight Empire, New Canada, all three had sent thousands into the meat grinder, and I wasn't about to do that to another faction without just cause. Even if it would see me through D rank the fastest. No, my gains were already good enough. Since arriving at Fort Hope to now, I'd gained 1400 stat points. Strength: 3827-4081, plus 254. Agility: 1759-1895, plus 136. Perception: 794-858, plus 64. Fortitude: 3175-3413, plus 238. Endurance: 2057-2193, plus 136. Vitality: 1280-1382, plus 102. Intelligence: 687-783, plus 96. Wisdom: 1094-1372, plus 278. Acumen: 646-742, plus 96. With my spirit inching its way back to health, my endurance slowly but surely returned to its previous ability. Battles took less out of me, and swinging my hammer for hours wasn't so draining as it had been. With that, I started pushing my free points back into wisdom as I had in the past. My mana pool was swiftly becoming my bottleneck, and I sought to fix that. Shattering Hammer, Frozen Rift, Hammer Reverberation weren't cheap, after all. Using Meteor Strike repeatedly wasn't either. Not to mention Tundra's Descent. I worried about my low perception, but at least I had ways around that. Aura detection was a big one. It shifted the impediment away from my low perception and propped it up with my powerful aura. It wasn't perfect, as I still had trouble keeping up with fast movements, but I was getting better. Relying on my eyes wasn't something I could fix in a snap. It was a long and slow process, but one I felt confident in expanding. Relying solely on my aura seemed like a bad idea, but it helped enough so that I wasn't worried about pushing free points into perception. Instead, I expanded my mana pool. At certain times, I wished I'd gone through with forging my first star, but the past was the past. I couldn't go back and change it. I didn't have the deep pool that Abigail and Gabriel had, and I probably never would. I shifted my thoughts away from my improvements and focused back on the here and now. Alyssa had fallen silent beside me, and I didn't want to disturb her any further. She would push through into the other side of the fog eventually. I was sure of it. She was a tough one. It didn't help that things would get worse before they got better, with Quebec on the horizon, but I felt confident. Frostheim was a city of resilient people. Leaving Alyssa, walked through what was left of the city. The walls falling took most of the buildings near it with them. That much stone tumbling down made it so only the most well-built structures survived the aftermath. Even then, not without some damage. Then, with the fighting, the closest few blocks to our entry point were decimated. Not a single one remained standing after the battle. Most of that was my fault, as I had been judicious with the use of my skills, but some fell victim to the charge of the golems. They were similar to a cavalry charge, in a way, but without the fear of running into buildings that normal horses and bison had. Most of the bodies had been cleared, which left only the ruins and rubble. In time, that would be cleared, and new buildings would be erected in their place. Weeks or months from now, it would be like the battle never happened. As I watched the Oathbound work with the citizens of the city to clear the worst of it, I thought ahead to the future. Vanessa's garrison force had already taken control of Ottawa and was getting things in order there, while I had yet to hear anything from Zuri. It had only been a few hours since we had informed her, but the response was slower than I would have liked. Message stones didn't reach from Montreal to Empire City, but we had people in place to relay them already. I had thought she would jump at the chance to start ceding new ground, but the delay worried me. Her faction was large, and she probably had a lot to do, but I had given her plenty of time to prepare. It had been months since I sent her the letter. Maybe it's because she's getting the manpower and equipment ready to clear it? It wasn't like there was farmland sitting idle for her. She and her workers would need to clear whatever they wished to plant. Cutting down trees, ripping out trunks, and cutting up roots. Turning over soil, fertilizing, weeding, and the rest of the work. It was hard labor, but it would help alleviate her food shortage. Yet she hadn't even responded yet. This is definitely going to be a problem later, I sighed. I could already see it down the line, but I had already set us down this path. I'd already asked her to take control of the city. Going back on it now wasn't possible without breaking my word. Other than Zuri, there were whispers coming out of Quebec that had me on edge. Word of our campaign was impossible to contain, and they had already heard of what had happened to their two sister cities. The entire city knew what was coming. From the fall of Smooth Rock to Montreal, they knew we were coming. Understandably, there was some worry and unrest over that fact. Unrest that was getting fed by the day, with how the leader of the city wasn't doing anything to stop it. Abigail was guessing that we would see the city ablaze by the time we got there ourselves. Was it bad that I hoped that was the case? Chapter 434. Political Backlash. Zuri Point of View. Location, Empire City. Her office was filled with piles upon piles of parchment and various missives containing everything from dire requests to petty demands. With so many people to shelter and take care of, it was a wonder how anything got done at all. Especially after the chaos of losing the war. Some liked to spout the claim that they hadn't technically lost, but Zuri knew for certain that they did. Even if the outcome of the duel was thrown out, they would have lost anyway, just with thousands of more losses. That fight, she still thought about it some days. The power that was thrown around, the scale of it all. She hadn't seen that much power concentrated in the hands of so few since the test. When she had fought with the Admiral, Liam, and the other lords and nobles of Eastern North America. Christopher was the one who scared her the most, and she wasn't afraid to admit it. Watching what he did to Ryan was frightening in every sense of the word. Even with Robert and the hidden guard in his way, he fought as a man possessed, and not one she wanted to be on the other side of any time soon. She was sure the time would come when she would stand opposite him once more. With lives extending for centuries and their two factions being close enough and rather prominent, a time would come in the future. She didn't wish it came anytime soon. Coming back to Empire City in defeat had nearly cost her everything. Her position was already under threat, and that was before a major defeat in what nearly everyone expected to be a sure thing. The calls for her to step down had been loud. Her, albeit technical, loss in the duel had the whispers grow in strength, and the rumor mill, fed by her enemies, hadn't helped matters. Zuri had gotten so fed up with it that she publicly called anyone willing to take her city from her. She knew Big John had been itching to do just that, but he had shied away from the opportunity. There were times that Zuri wished he hadn't, just so she didn't have to deal with everything. Admittedly, her faction was in better standing now than it had been before the war, but that wasn't all because of good reasons. Sure, they had a few more trade partners for food and resources, but the main reason they were doing better was that they had fewer people. The thousands dead were a drop in the bucket to their total population, but there were also those who migrated to Frostheim especially. She had exchanged letters with the Lady of Frostheim since returning, and they had a large incentive to get people to immigrate to the north. They were paid a decent amount just for arriving, and opportunities were made available to them depending on which trade or profession they took up. She had half a mind to send off her most troublesome citizens, but she knew that wouldn't go over well. Instead, she had suitably warned her that some unwanted settlers may arrive along with those who wished well. Her office door creaked open, and Zuri looked up to see her assistant, Amelia, entering with a missive. It lacked any seal, so she assumed it was received through the network of message stones and relays. If there was a good thing from the war, it was that. Well? Zuri questioned. Amelia walked forward and handed out the letter. It's from the north. They have taken Montreal and asked that we send men to keep the peace, along with anyone else we wish to farm the land. Already, wars were not her expertise. Even before, she hadn't been all that fascinated with history or fantasy that involved wars. Her tutorial had instilled some of that knowledge, but she was still lacking when it came to these matters. Her first large-scale battle had been the test, and that hadn't been anything close to a real war. From the reports and letters Rossi and DeLuca had sent her during the war, it was a slow slog that was nothing like the movies she had seen. Taking the city at first was more political maneuvering than real war. There had been battles, but those were mainly small skirmishes rather than anything. When she first got Lord Christopher's letter, she had thought it would be half a year or more before Montreal would be taken. She certainly knew how difficult it was to make any headway against fortified positions. They had smashed against Vanessa's forts for weeks before any headway was made, and even then, it had been slow. The message was just as Amelia said, except in the curt and direct hand of what she had come to know as Christopher's hand. How are our preparations going? Zuri couldn't help but ask. She had set things in motion, but they were certainly nowhere close to ready. Barely moving, Amelia said curtly. She knew Zuri didn't care for false platitudes. Barely moving? Zuri repeated. There should be at least some movement of the men and materials. I had Rossi handle things personally. Rossi had lost some of his prestige since his failed campaign, but he was still a baron appointed by her hand specifically. He knew how vital the opportunity they were being given was. Governing the city was minuscule compared to the land they were given stewardship over. Vast swaths of land could be cleared and planted, which would greatly aid their food troubles. Zuri didn't want to be too hopeful, but she dreamed this would settle things for good, and all it took was someone else's war. Amelia hesitated to find the right words. Rossi is doing his best, but his preparations are being delayed. Zuri's mana churned angrily. Delayed. She knew what that meant. She had faced it herself all too often, and it made her want to rip her hair out. With a city, let alone faction, being as large as it was, management was crucial. But those same layers of management were turned against her at each and every opportunity. Some were bought off. Some were blackmailed. Some were threatened. Some, she didn't even know why they fought her. Most of it stemmed back to Big John, but sadly, he wasn't even the only actor. Her own barons fought her. Rossi didn't, as she would remove him in a heartbeat if he ever tried the things the other 5 did. But Whitman, Prescott, and Garcia were another matter. Those 3 greedy imbeciles were only out for themselves. Who is it this time? Zuri asked, defeated. Once again, she harbored thoughts of resigning and making a go of being an adventurer. All of them, Amelia answered. She wanted to scream. Her aura certainly expressed her inner desire, but she contained it before it got too out of control. Prescott's fighting back because of her stake in grain trading. Zuri barely contained her voice from yelling. She would see this as a threat to her wealth and control over the food trade. She had gotten rich while people starved. Zuri wanted to kill the woman, but half the city would riot if she went through with the execution. Whitman's in bed with her, she said derisively. The 2 barons of Manhattan and Staten Island often sided together in most matters because of that fact. Why is Garcia sandbagging? Zuri asked, unable to come up with why Diego would fight her on this. His borough was one of the ones hardest hit. He claims that the resources are better used on alternative measures. Instead of wasting manpower and resources on city and land that will be taken away from us, and instead of helping our enemy, he wants it used here in research for higher-yielding crops, better fertilizers, spells, and expanded hydroponics. Amelia listed off with a blank face. Zuri took deep breaths. So while we continue to struggle feeding our people, he fights my path forward because he thinks he knows better? She said through gritted teeth. It was times like this where 2 people wanted the same thing, but fought each other over the way, that pissed her off the most. Yes, ma'am, Amelia nodded. Call him here. I want to speak with him, Zuri said. And Prescott, too. I want to see what reason she comes up with when I ask her why she's hindering what I've already approved. And her office door was pushed open without a knock, cutting off the rest of what she was about to say. What are you? Zuri trailed off as she saw the man who'd rudely interrupted. Marco, what are you doing here? She'd fired him months ago and hadn't seen him since. Zuri still wasn't sure if he was in bed with someone or just plain bad at his job. She'd never had the time or the want to find out. Marco didn't answer right away, but stepped into the room proper and sidled up next to where Amelia stood across from her desk. Something was wrong. The feeling nagged at her as she saw how odd he was acting. Marco hadn't always been the best aide or advisor, but he hadn't acted this oddly. Mark? She began to stand, reaching for her staff, but didn't get to finish before he lunged at her, pulling a hidden dagger from behind his back. The blade was dark and coated in something. The liquid was clear even to her mana sense now that she aimed it at him specifically. Her thoughts whirled a mile a minute as she called on her mana and bloodline both. Fully transforming would take too long, but she called on her bloodline on instinct as she marshaled her mana and forced it into a spell form as quickly as possible. Her staff still lay out of reach, so she raised her hand at the oncoming assassin with a grim expression. Stellar Lance. The spell ripped through the office with enough mana to cast for such spells. Zuri leveraged her law to the limit, leaving nothing to chance. The 2-foot-wide beam of blindingly bright magic leapt from her hand and shot out quicker than she could make out. Her eyes weren't as affected against the bright light, but even she had to blink twice before she could see again. A wet thud sounded below her, and she looked down to see a severed hand clutching a dagger inches away from her foot. Whatever was on it dripped onto the floor, corroding the wood floorboards. Zuri raised her eyes to see 2 severed legs flop over as the rest of the body had been removed from existence. A hand and 2 lower legs were all that was left of Marco, along with a hole in her office that she could see outside through, along with 4 other rooms her spell had traveled through to get there. Amelia was stunned, and Zuri could see blood running down her arm from where her spell went wide. They had been standing too close together, and her arm had been caught by her lance. Thankfully, it hadn't taken the whole arm, but Amelia definitely needed a healer. Fuck it. Fuck this. Fuck them. Fuck it all. If they want to play, I'll show them how to play. She couldn't control how mad she felt and nearly collapsed the building further under her aura. She tried sparing Amelia, but from the wince, she wasn't doing that well. I'm sick of these games. Zuri spat. I've tried the nice way. Now we're going the not-so-nice way. She wasn't sure if Big John was behind the attempt on her life or if it was someone else, but it didn't much matter to her at this point. She needed to put her city in order, and the man had already done enough to sentence him to death. The political backlash for doing so had always been too much. He had too many hands in too many pies, along with the money to sway a lot of supporters. Now she didn't give a shit what happened next. They would fall in line or they would be exiled. Those who lived long enough. Chapter 435 pushed things along. Chris' point of view. The camp was more subdued than it had ever been. When this war had started, all the way back when we marched south coming to Marcus's aid, the nightly camps had been loud and upbeat. People laughed and joked around campfires without the heaviness that now strangled the camp. It seemed the idea of war was more valiant and glorious than the real thing. After months of it, life on the road was dreary. How much blood had been shed didn't help. Montreal was swifter than Ottawa, but no less bloody. Instead of jokes and loud storytelling, it was grim faces and brooding that could be seen around a campfire. The closer we got to Quebec, the quieter things became. Everyone knew they were marching towards more blood. The life and heat of their emotions at the start had slowly dwindled. It didn't help that the troops didn't feel as strongly as I did about Ryan and his sword. I tried to convey how much of a threat it was and how much of a problem it could be if left alone, but no one but my family really understood. There were others who were close, as some tutorials were worse than others, but no one held the burning hatred as I did. The fact that they had followed me to war without that hatred was a surprise. That they followed was expected. That they did it with such vigor at the start most certainly wasn't. It was like they heard my words and that was enough for them. Such loyalty was invigorating, but it was also frightening. What if I led them astray? None of the oathbound liked to gainsay me, and even the best of men could be led down the wrong path. It made me doubt myself. We'd been through 6 cities so far without hide nor hair of Ryan anywhere. Not in Fort Hope, not in Smooth Rock, not in Ste. Marie, not in Shieldreach, not in Ottawa, and not in Montreal. Would Quebec finally be the one? Would we march on Sherbrooke next? If he wasn't there, march on Augusta? Would we have to search all of Nova Scotia? What of the islands off the east coast? How would we even get there? Would it take razing every city New Canada had? It was too late for my conviction to waver now, but I couldn't help but wonder how much further I could push this. How much further should I push this? Why the long face? Someone I hadn't expected took a seat next to me by the fire. I'd been by my lonesome since the sun had set, but now that was broken. Many reasons, brother, many reasons? I muttered, unwilling to break the silence I had basked in more than that. I never took you for a brooder. He snarked and nudged my shoulder. It doesn't suit you. I sighed. I worry is all. I see it in everyone that this war has been draining. Not only the lives lost, but the spirit. We're winning, sure, but that doesn't mean it's without cost. Gabriel stared into the fire at my words, thinking. He was never one to rush for words. I'll give you that, but what's the alternative? We go back now. I continue on my own, I said, which I had been feeling for a while now. I could search for the sword and Ryan much faster by myself. Ha! Gabriel scoffed. You'd have a better chance turning back time. Killian searched for weeks and found no trail. We have no idea where he is, let alone in what direction he fled. The highest odds were that he'd flee to Ottawa, but he wasn't there, nor in Montreal. From what we're hearing out of Quebec, I doubt he's there either. He wouldn't have let it get that bad. I know, but it's better than doing nothing. I said firmly, sure, we're taking the cities, but for what? Conquest wasn't the reason we started this. No, but it is still a decent one. He rebutted. It's a reason as old as time and factions are and have already used it. I didn't do this for conquest, I said softly, but I feel like a warmonger all the same. Is that what has you like this? Gabriel turned to face me. When you left, I thought you would stop at nothing until that sword was found. Your face was like granite. It was so hard. I'm just tired, I admitted, slumping a little in my chair. Tired of it all. We have no leads on where Ryan or the Sword are, or if they're even together anymore. Killian, Hal, and even Gavin haven't found anything. Nor any of the spies Abigail sent out. Spies? Really? Gabe raised a questioning eyebrow. I guess I shouldn't be so surprised. It's not that out of character. If only you knew, brother. Then I ask again, what's the alternative? If you're set on finding this sword, what other options do you have? Gabriel asked. I don't know, Gabe, I said. I'm just tired of this gloom. It reminds me of times best left in the past. I spent a long time looking into the fire after that, while my brother didn't have a response at hand. He knew what had happened. We hadn't held anything back from him, but it was a thing to hear of it, and another to live it. The experience was a sad divider that I wished wasn't there. Battle after battle. Time after time of cleaning blood off my armor. I described, I know it's not the same, but I can't help but feel like they are. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, Chris, Gabe said quietly. The sun will shine again. I know, I said. You're right, but I just wish that day comes soon. Me too. The conversation died there, and we just enjoyed each other's company. It wasn't long before either of us made for bed, even though I didn't really need it. I'd slept the day before, but it was better than dwelling in my own thoughts. We broke camp with practiced ease the next morning, and we're on the march once more. Honestly, it was probably the most boring part of this whole thing. Sitting in camp wasn't much better, but at least you could drink, train, or work on anything you needed to. Being stuck on my horse, padding forward with nothing to do was dreadful. It didn't help that we were so slow. Thousands of people weren't fast to begin with, but with supplies and wagons being pulled, it went even slower. Not to mention the roads were abysmal. It seems Ryan spent his resources elsewhere rather than focusing on them, which was just another stupid move. Roads were the heart of trade and travel. History proved that having well-paved roads was well worth the expense. Rome proved that, smoke ahead, a voice cried. My eyes narrowed over the tops of the trees, and I could just barely make out a dark column rising into the air. It didn't take long to trace it down to its origin. Isn't that? Anders trailed off. Yes, I said. It seems Quebec is on fire. Riders were sent out ahead, and the news they brought back was good, but I couldn't bring myself to feel happy about it. The city had broken out in riots, and people were killing each other in the streets. The city lord and a loyal band of guards were fighting off against the other half of the guards and the citizens. From what the scryers reported, it was full-on pandemonium. Guards were fighting against guards. Citizens roved the streets in mobs. Adventurers fighting on both sides, but it was hard to tell which was which. My first instinct was to rush forward while the city was weakened, but I wasn't sure if that would make things better or worse. I settled for hastening our pace and keeping an eye on things. We were still hours from the city and were in no position to attack. In the end, my decision wasn't necessary, as when we finally came into view of the city's walls, the gates stood open and a party stood waiting. Wary of traps, I took Elliot and Anders with me to greet them. They had the best defenses and stood the best chance of getting away if this turned sour. The party waiting for us consisted of 6 people, all in various states. The man standing front and center had blood on his armor and looked like he'd just done battle, but was relatively fine. A woman to his left looked drained, but was without any blood. A man on his right looked 2 seconds away from keeling over. The last 3 were all in between. The man at the front stepped forward as we neared. Viscount Zelensky, the city is yours. Of all the things that could have come out of his mouth, that was the last thing I expected. For him and the other 5 to then kneel even more so. Just like that? I asked, confused. Just like that, the man confirmed. We heard what you did at Fort Hope, and we only ask that you agree to the same terms. Search the city all you like, but Lord Claremont isn't here, and we haven't seen him. I still held some suspicions, but it seemed like the man was entirely genuine. The gates were opened, and no one stood ready on the walls. The only guards were those trying to re-establish order and put out fires. I nodded. Fine then. You have my word. No harm will come to the innocent. The man breathed out a sigh of relief and finally picked himself up from the floor along with the rest of his party. They all showed visible signs of relief which, when I thought about it, made sense. Are you the lord of the city? I asked. The man shook his head. No, Lord Dustin was, but he is no longer. At my questioning eyes, he continued. When we heard Montreal fell and you were coming, those who wanted to flee fled, and those not willing to leave tried to urge him to surrender. Even with a majority of his guard begging him to, he remained unwilling. When it became clear that he wouldn't even entertain the notion, we asked that he face you in combat. We heard of what the Lord of Shield Reach did, and urged him to do that if only to save lives. The man sneered. Even that he was unwilling to do. So, with no other choice except to die for someone unwilling to die for us, we pushed things along, he said, choosing his words carefully. Not how I saw the day going, but what the hell. Chapter 436. The French. Chris' point of view. Location. Quebec. Jesus Christ, Ugh. Sophia's frustration was palpable, which was funny given her usual collected and proper attitude. They're doing it on purpose. I wouldn't be surprised if some are. I smirked at her. They are French after all. Fuck the French, she muttered. Sophia had worked wonders in the transition periods after we had taken a settlement. She'd done so for every pylon we conquered so far, but none of them had caused her as much frustration as this one. She wasn't alone in it, either, as everyone had felt a chaffing after we took the city. Not everyone could speak the language, which had led to a few problems, but it was the attitude that most disliked. Frostheim was just too different. It would be different if we had taken the city like we had the others. There was a certain subduedness after we came in, swords raised and conquered through force. Not that it was better, but when the city surrendered as they had, that subduedness was lacking. They didn't go as far as defiant, but there was a self-pride and a touch of resentment that made the transition more difficult than the others. The pacification, if you wish to call it. Not that the other cities weren't resentful, but they had fear to temper it with. Quebec did not. Sure, they feared me, but they hadn't come face to face with my hammer like the others had. Things are going that well. Then, I asked. No, Sophia's gaze smoldered. No, they're not. It's like they fight me just for fighting's sake. Even when I try to explain why our way is better, they refuse it on principle. Their bureaucracy sucks, but they cling to it like a child and its favorite toy. The language barrier doesn't help, I muttered. It was proving to be an interesting obstacle. Everyone in Frostheim and its lands spoke English. We had a few French Canadians, but they were severely outnumbered. Here, in what was the heart of French Canada, English speakers were well outnumbered. The day-to-day language was French. People walking the streets spoke French. Merchant vendors spoke French. The temporarily reinstated guards spoke French. I imagined that most knew both, but just chose not to for pettiness' sake, which had Sophia so frustrated. The problem itself was annoying. The interesting part of the problem was the remedy. Professions that were so far less used had their time to shine. Explorers were few and far between, but there were a few in the army. Merchants, too. Quartermasters. Logistical officers. Artists. All had some form of translation ability, with some better than others. It was nice to see people who hadn't gotten a chance to show their worth have their day in the sun. Even if the inefficiency peeved Sophia and my sister. Don't even get me started on the language barrier, Sophia grunted. Besides those areas, Sophia detailed that the transition was going well. Slower than we liked and certainly less smooth, but moving forward. Even when we weren't the ones who fought, there were still bodies to clear and buildings to repair. Way fewer than if we had taken the city ourselves, but not none. It seemed that the lord of the city took most of his higher-ranking officials with him to the grave. Whether they did so out of loyalty or were forced, I didn't know, but I could certainly take a guess. Based on Ryan's use of demon blood contracts with Bree, Ashton, and a few others, I was certain he did the same with the lords under him. How many or how far down the chain of command he went, though, I wasn't sure. Sophia, gather our war council, please. We need to plan what our next steps are. I asked my assistant, who nodded and left. Her reports were finished, and she had nothing else to bring up. The first to enter our commandeered command center was Abigail, who must have been close by with how soon she arrived. Elliot and Anders walked in next. Sydney and Gavin next, with Hal and Gabriel not long after. Meredith and Jax came last. Every other lieutenant was either too injured or remained in Montreal. Zuri still hadn't sent out anyone to rule the city yet, and the news coming from Empire City was troubling. Some rumors said that Zuri had been assassinated. Others said she went on a mad rampage, killing half the city. So far, there had been no word from her, and all we knew for certain was that something had happened. People were most certainly dead, and buildings had been destroyed. That bit was consistent over all the rumors. Before I could open my mouth to speak, a runner rushed in with a slip of paper held out. "Sorry, my lord, urgent news from the south." Heads swiveled not only at his pace, but also at the urgency in his voice. I took the slip and opened it as my eyes took in the information as quickly as possible. It bore no seal, which likely meant it was transcribed from message stones. Augusta has ceded itself to New Boston, with Brienne as its new ruler. I read aloud for the sake of the room. Its leader was disposed, and the new one elected to join Bree's faction. She writes that no signs of Ryan have been found, and no one in the city has seen him. Disposed how? Elliot asked. It doesn't say. I held out the slip after I was finished reading it. There was some more information about what had happened, but none on anything specific. Does it matter? Sydney scoffed. The left side of her face was still pink from her recent appointment with the healers. An arrow had sliced through her cheek and taken her entire left ear during the attack on Ottawa. Since she was deemed non-life-threatening and aesthetic, her turn with the healers was only just coming around now. Either way, it's a city we don't have to take by force. But it's a city we don't get to take. Anders rumbled. We couldn't have held it anyway. What does it matter if it defects to New Boston rather than us? Hal scoffed. Abigail held the slip for the longest time, reading and rereading. It's not only Augusta, but everything south of Waterville. Bar Harbor, Rockland, and Ellsworth. Bah, they're no better than small towns. I doubt they have a small city-level pylon between them. Gabriel retorted. As he'd gotten more comfortable with leadership, he'd spoken more and more during these meetings. Augusta wasn't. It was city-level. Not a noble one, I admit, but still a city. Elliot pointed out. I was glad at this turn of events. It was one less region we had to bloody our blades in. I was so tired of it already, and having more pylons fall peacefully was all well in my book. Well, the leader of Augusta certainly felt it was done peacefully, but I didn't much care at this point. We'll send a few of Killian's team to sweep the area, but I doubt anything will turn up. Brienne has her own bone to pick with Ryan, and I doubt she'd do a poor job of trying to find him. I said, thinking of the immediate next steps, but I don't see much problem with it. We won't get to steal their treasury, Abigail pointed out, and there were more than a few who nodded. We didn't do this for coin. My words came out a bit harder than necessary, but the point was still made. Are we in such need of it after Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec? Well, no, Abigail hesitated. But it would have been nice. The reports from Frostheim have our revenue down quite a bit with all of us gone. Nothing terrible, but it will be felt. Why wasn't Augusta already owned by New Boston? Or its own faction, at least? It was in Maine, not Canada, Meredith asked. Especially with how close the two are. A week's travel, maybe less. Didn't know. I thought it odd at first, but hadn't really followed up all that much on the why behind it. The borders had already been drawn at that point. Ryan came out of the tutorial with more authority than Brienne did. She wasn't the first lord of New Boston. Liam was, and he died in St. Louis. Even before that, it wasn't an easy ascension to power, which left them slow on the uptake, which Ryan capitalized on. Of course, it was Abigail who knew. There were other reasons, but those were the main ones. Liam also wasn't as ambitious as Ryan, which helped, and didn't really set out to conquer right away. They have Portland, though? Meredith responded. Why conquer one and not the other? Liam didn't conquer Portland. He subsumed it when New Boston grew, and Portland wanted protection from demons. This was before the formation and the test, of course. Abigail explained. I'm content to let her have it, for a small fee for forcing it to happen. Add it to the price of letting her run Quebec, I said. The region wasn't all that important. The sooner the better, I heard someone mutter. Sophia's sentiment was widely felt, and the sooner Brienne came, the better. But that changes our next steps. I waved a hand at the map. Without Augusta, we need to decide on our path forward. We could go north to the smaller towns and villages, or we can go east. East was not the way I wanted to go. On the map, there was a long demarcation drawn in green where the eastern coast had broken off from New Canada. The Sea Lord Leon had broken ranks and dragged a few other cities with him. He'd sent word that the traitor Ryan, his words, wasn't in Newfoundland or Labrador, and if he ever set foot there again, Leon would shove my trident so far up his ass he'll eat the shaft. The tone alone made it clear there was no love lost between the two. It made sense, considering the later information we had been able to gather. The contracts he forced him to sign. Leon wasn't like Ashton. Fort Hope was far away and held little influence in anything New Canada did. Leon held a large city and was much more influential. Some said he had tried to become a baron, but Ryan denied him the chance. He had been forced to sign, whereas Ashton was able to refuse. Now, he had broken it somehow. I had an idea of how, which made going east all the more tricky. So far, the only way we had been able to break contracts made in demon blood, like the case of Lakeshore and Brienne, was that spirit energy was necessary. Someone with an anchor needed to break it for them. Or, as I suspected in Leon's case, he formed one himself and broke it that way. Reports from the east said he was a warrior first, like I was. He pawned administration off on someone else while he enjoyed fighting the sea beasts along the coasts. His martial nature, ability to raise himself to Viscount so swiftly, along with a suspected spirit anchor, made him not someone to antagonize lightly. I didn't fear him, but I also wasn't eager to test that. I still couldn't use my spirit without pain, which would put me at a major disadvantage. If I hadn't had my spirit while fighting Tasunka, that battle might have gone entirely differently. Plus, even without meeting the man, I trusted that Ryan wasn't there. All in all, the next steps we were about to take had changed. Chapter 437, How Wrong She Was. Brienne point of view. Ever since that godforsaken too good to be true contract had been put in front of her, her life had forever changed. She had, hilariously, thought that winning the city over from Liam's incompetent brother would be the most difficult trial she would face. Oh, how wrong she had been. Beating that fool was nothing compared to the nightmare that came after. That cunt with his nice words and charming, disarming smile. Ugh, how could she have fallen for that? Every day after, she cursed herself and her stupidity. Bree had assumed that when that tether pulled, and she was forced to answer, that it would be her last. She had delegated New Boston to someone she trusted. She had put her affairs in order, and her ducks were in line. She had stepped out of her city, expecting never to come back. In some ways, she was more right than wrong. Being forced to fight him nearly accomplished what she had feared. She was lucky that it wasn't her he was after. Bree knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that one solid swing from his hammer and she would be ended. The curtains would close, and darkness would be all she wrote. But the swing never came. She had used little of her skills or abilities, nothing more than what she was forced. Ryan's contract didn't force effort, and she had put in the minimum. Even fighting as stiffly and languishing as she had, the man had fought off her, Ryan, Robert, and a hidden assassin. Even if she had been giving it her all, she severely doubted the outcome would have changed overly much. There was just something about that man. Gravity had literally been against him, yet he lumbered his way towards his target all the same. The way he fought, the way he moved, the force involved, it was like nature bent to his whims rather than the other way around. And now, she was a few moments away from meeting that force of nature face to face once again. He was a man rightfully feared, and she couldn't help but dread every footfall that dragged her closer. Oh, she highly doubted anything would happen, but that didn't mean that fear just disappeared. Once witnessed, that capacity for sheer violence was impossible to ignore. After that day, it was like she was living her second life, rather than continuing her first. She had been told to wait in flame falls, so she had waited. Whether it was true or not that he could help break the contract didn't matter. Podrick had nearly screamed her ear off when he heard she was alive and well. Shaken, but well. He talked so fast she could barely get a word in. About the city, about the dungeons. Her steward talked just about everything, from the newest guard reaching D-rank to the petty crime rates. She had known New Boston had been left in good hands, but it reassured her to hear it. It was weeks before anybody eventually came for her. The man wore the usual thick furs in the northern style, but he wore them well. The tunic, the pants, the cloak, and even the accessories combined for a refined image, regardless of fur. He called himself John, but from the weeks of intelligence gathering, Brienne knew it was not as simple as that. No, John, as he called himself, was Jonathan Stevenson, brother-in-law to Christopher, the Lord of Frost. Guard commander of all of Frostheim's forces. Husband to the ruler of Frostheim. The docket from the Society on Frostheim had been expensive, more so than any other time she had bought information, but it was worth it. Without it, she wouldn't have known that the man, John, had held the wall during the test for nearly the entire duration of the assault. Only the Lady of the Mountain had done the same. She would not have known he was rumored to be one of the top 5 strongest of Frostheim's forces. She wouldn't have known that he had a spirit anchor, nearly a Tier 3 law, a body of copper, and a suspected epic class and profession. No, without that knowledge, she would never have suspected that the friendly, near-jovial man was as dangerous as he was. Bree certainly would not have connected the image from their first meeting to the fearsome warrior he was without that. When he had arrived, it wasn't him who had stolen her attention. Her eyes were too focused on the teenage girl bounding along with him. She had been a bundle of energy that never seemed to settle. Can we go see the flame, Dad? Can we check out the dungeon? How come there's so much glass? Can we meet Vanessa? Do you think that if they dueled again, she would win? How did she get the name Flame Witch? When do you think I'll get a name like that? Uncle Topher already has one. They call him the Lord of Frost. Do you have a name like that? The questions weren't quite as rapid-fire, but it was close enough. Like the long journey of holding it all in had finally exploded out when they finally reached their destination. That first impression alone made it hard to equate the image she had in her mind with the one she had read, but the words weren't lost on her. There was only one person people called the Lord of Frost, and if the teenage girl was calling him uncle, and the man before her dad, then this could only be Annabeth. It was funny to her that the girl quieted down as they neared, but it was already too late for that. Nobody suspected Brienne of having as high a perception as she did, and it was endlessly funny to overhear what people didn't expect her to. The hardest part was acting like she didn't. So instead of interacting with an obviously overeager girl, she had schooled her face and acted like she hadn't heard a word. The greeting from then on was stiff but understandable. She didn't know him and he didn't know her. And, if Brienne read things right, he didn't exactly want to be there. He didn't show it, and he certainly didn't say it, but Bree could feel it. It was like he had somewhere in mind he wanted to be, yet he was here instead. That led to their conversations being short but friendly enough. Some introductions, a light small talk, and then he took her into a room to begin the process. She hadn't been sure what he would do, because she hadn't been told, but she could definitely feel it when he started. It wasn't mana, and it wasn't a law, but something surrounded her in a power she could barely feel. She knew it was spirit energy, but it certainly didn't feel like any energy she knew. Fighting her natural reaction to fight back, she sat and probed what she could as stealthily as possible. She had no clue if she was indeed being stealthy or if she was being totally obvious. It felt like flailing around a lit room with a blindfold on, hoping you weren't seen. Still, she hadn't known what would happen or how it would break her contract, but she certainly felt it when it happened. It could have been minutes or hours after it began, but pain like no other seared through her on a level scarcely felt, like refining her body, but deeper than mere flesh and bone, like her soul was being scoured, scraped, and wrung out. The smothering leash she had felt ever since signing that blasted paper fell away, and even though her eyes filled with tears from the pain, she couldn't keep the smile from her face. Now, if I ever see that bastard again, I'll end him myself. It wasn't long after that the man left back from whence he came. They stayed for a few days for the girl to explore and see what she could, but they didn't stay for long after the deed was done. Neither did Brienne. Not that Vanessa's hospitality was bad, but after all that had happened, she didn't want to spend any more time in Flame Falls than she had to. People didn't look at her with resentment or anger, but they certainly weren't overly friendly or happy with her presence. They didn't forget which side she had fought on, even if it had only been brief. Telling them all that it hadn't been a choice wouldn't have done much, she felt. They were angry and wanted somewhere to point that anger. With her being the only option, it was her they pointed it at. With the contract broken and her oath given that she had promised after the fight, she was left to her own devices and allowed to return home. It wasn't long after that a letter arrived asking her to fulfill her obligation. Not wanting to be on the other side of the hammer, she set out immediately and now found herself looking over the surprisingly intact city of Quebec. With her, she brought administrators, guards, farmers, and all manner of other professions. She was to be given stewardship of the large city of Quebec, and she would do it well. Money, resources, and manpower she brought all she could spare, especially translators. She even purchased a device to translate for her, just to make things that much easier. It wasn't cheap, but she was determined to make it worth it. During the time the city was in her care, she would make the most of it. Not only because it would please Frostheim, but it would give her the resources she needed to grow her faction. After seeing all she had during the war, she knew that New Boston was weak. Oh, she was a baron all right, and she had a noble-level city pylon, but they were weak. Any one faction in the northeast could have beaten her, and there would have been little she could have done about it. It had opened her eyes and removed any excuse of ignorance she could have uttered. Even the new Sea Lord was of a higher rank than her, and he had only just broken away from Ryan's grasp. It was humiliating. She had thought herself lofty after becoming a baroness, when in reality, she was at the bottom of a rapidly growing totem pole. A well-dressed guard, better than the average guard she had spied, met her just outside the gates to the city. Bree wasn't sure what rank the man held, but it was certainly above the average soldier based on how he was dressed and the weapon at his hip. Baroness Farland, the guard greeted as she stepped forward. No bow or nod in recognition of her title, just a welcome greeting. Viscount Zelensky bids you welcome and thanks you for your prompt arrival. There was a bite to his words, but she could tell they weren't meant for her. Putting that behind her, she replied, I thank you for the opportunity. I've brought along all I could spare, along with plenty of translators, as the letter said. She waved at the hundreds gathered behind her. Most were guards to keep the peace. I will show you to your quarters then, follow me. Walking through the city, Bree expected it to be much more ruined. She had heard the tales that were coming out of Ottawa and Montreal. Walls collapsed, buildings destroyed, entire blocks in ruins. This didn't look like that. It was also too soon for repairs, not that it appeared that way. There were signs of it here and there, but not on the scale she had expected. Was the siege difficult? She asked, trying to make small talk. I've heard rumors of Ottawa and Montreal, but nothing of here. The man grimaced. There was no siege. The city surrendered at our arrival. What? She spotted the workers putting a shop back together and the new walls being erected. That was before our arrival. The man saw her gaze. The old leadership lost the sentiment of the people. Lost the sentiment of the people is one way of putting it. From the whispers and conversations she could overhear, it was much more profound than that. Context was hard to grasp, but the more she heard, the clearer the picture became. The Lord was dead set on fighting to the last, while everyone else wasn't. Rebellion was what gained them the city, not a siege. This bodes well. If they're smart enough to submit, that means my work here will be easier. Oh, how wrong she was. Chapter 438 Smooth Negotiations. Chris' point of view. My lord, she's here. An oath-bound. A member of the Bear Order based on his dress. interrupted our war council with news I had been waiting to hear all day. I knew Brienne was on her way and would be here soon, but it was nice that it was now. It beat waiting any longer. We had already been in Quebec longer than I had anticipated, and with our relief finally here, we could get on with things. "Send her in, please," I announced. The War Council honestly hadn't gotten anywhere with our next plans besides laying out possibilities we could go down. There were many, but not any I wished to see through. War had wearied me, and I was man enough to say it. The absolute last thing I wanted to do was wage it across the rest of the country. I would, if that was required, but it was looking more and more like it wouldn't be. Ryan or his sword weren't here. All outriders that were sent to faraway settlements had heard nothing of either the man or the weapon. I highly doubted he was even in the country anymore. There weren't that many pylons left to check, and of those that were, none were high-level. Outposts, mainly where the population wasn't even over 1,000. Leon had taken the highest of what was left and written that Ryan wasn't there, signing his word to the fact. Bree wrote that he wasn't at any of the pylons she had recently taken over, either. That left small communities in the far north or wilderness, and none of those were likely to house the man. No, Killian had once said that he escaped with outside help, and I was more and more inclined to believe it. Only outside help and out-of-faction help as well. Ryan had been taken somewhere, but I had no idea where. It honestly could be anywhere. I doubted it was Flame Falls, for Vanessa's hatred of the man neared my own. It wouldn't be the Empirical lands either, for Zuri hated him too. Bree also. That left the Stormlands, the Great Lakes, and the American faction as the nearest big ones. Nashville, Three Rivers, and St. Louis too, but they were smaller. Or a faction further afield in the far west or far south. All told, we hadn't a clue where he was. The tent flap parted, and Brienne walked in with her head held high and back straight. There was an effect on her that had been missing before. Like the contract being broken had lifted a weight from her while also reinstating her pride. "Viscount Zelensky, I thank you for your invitation," she said and dipped her head diplomatically. "Baroness Farland, thank you for coming," I responded. I very much wanted to rush into the meat of the matter, but I played these stupid games all the same. "Sit, join us." I motioned to an empty chair at the table. Brienne accepted and seated herself next to Anders and Sydney, who were the only two lieutenants to join us for this council. The rest had other duties or were elsewhere. That left the three order masters, Elliot, Hal, and Gabriel, along with Abigail. The seven of us made an impressive sight, if I did say so myself, but Bree didn't show any fear. The fighting had done us well, and we were now at the highest level in the faction. Based on reports, the highest level in the region as well. I figure we should get into the finer details of this handover before we get too far into everything else, I said evenly. I'll be straight with you, we just don't have the manpower or the resources to hold a city as large as this one as far away as it is. The effort just isn't worth it. If she was surprised at my bluntness, she didn't show it. We hadn't had the privilege of many conversations together, but we had had a few by this point. Most are coming after the duel. Instead, what we're offering is for you to hold temporary governance until such a time comes when that changes. That could be months from now or maybe years, depending on how things go. Seeing how Quebec sits furthest west and farthest away from Frostheim, it will also be the last we retake control over. I see, she responded, urging me to continue. That being said, what we expect from you is simple. While we've taken strides to get the city back in order, a majority of that effort will fall on your shoulders. The discontent isn't as large as it could have been, but it's still there. That being said, we're not asking you to do this for free. While you are in command of the city, you may use its resources and its lands to your leisure, with a few exceptions and without causing irrevocable damage. I added that last part after a look from Abigail. She wanted a long, drawn-out contract on what they would and wouldn't be able to do while in charge. That was fine, but I wasn't going to be the one hammering it out. I was just laying the ground rules down. Technically, with the rights to the land and resources, they could strip mine anything they find and ruin the fertility by growing fast crops again and again. Similar to the Dust Bowl, but made worse by crop growth skills. If you just spammed those types of skills, you stripped the ground of all it was worth. The exceptions were if any rare or strategic resources were found, like another mana crystal mine. She had wanted this to have more finesse, but I just wasn't going to go through the trouble. It was easier for everyone to lay our cards on the table. Clearly state our expectations and plans. I was sure Bree understood, and if she didn't, well, I'd cross that bridge when it came time for it. Also, this was the first face-to-face conversation we were having about any of this. Zuri still hadn't shown up, and our agreement with Vanessa was slightly different than the other two on the account that we were allies. She was trustworthy enough that I didn't feel the need for a formal sit-down. We had helped her, and she wasn't the type to renege on an agreement. At this point, Abigail helpfully jumped in, laying out the preliminary contracts she had drawn up. Brienne flinched at the sight, and I felt bad for her. These were just plain magical contracts where the worst that would happen was a strong debuff if broken. Not like the ones she had signed before. For the most part, Abigail spread the papers out, you will have free rein to do what you wish besides a few caveats. All farming is permitted as long as it doesn't impede the viability of the land after your governance ends. Lumber works are fine as long as seedlings are replanted. Hunting is fine as long as you don't cull everything into extinction. Mines and quarries, as long as they are excavated without damaging the land. Besides those natural resources, all others found or located need to be negotiated for. To incentivize prospecting, any locations found will result in a suitable reward depending on what was found. My sister pointed out where each specific clause was located with ease, even with the contract being upside down to her. She'd pored over it for so long I wouldn't be surprised if she had the whole thing memorized. There was also a chart listing rewards for known resources already. Any iron, copper, or coal was on the low end as they were commonly found. Granite and marble were higher, as the hard stone was used in fortifications and marble for luxury buildings. Mana crystals were the highest, but I doubted any would be found. With the mine outside of Fort Hope, there wasn't a high chance of another vein being found so nearby. The rest were left open as we still weren't sure what was all out there. Affinitized metals were being found already, alone with news of elementals as well. Some rumors even said Jayla ran into a nest of earth elementals digging her tunnel. Honestly, the more mana Earth had, and the longer it saturated the land, the weirder things became. We hadn't known mana crystals were possible until we found them, after all. Brienne took it all in with a masked expression, but I could tell she was satisfied. The terms were generous in my opinion, where both sides benefited. Technically, I was stronger than her and could have forced her, but that wasn't how I wanted to do things. I had no interest in a larger conquest, and with our recent expansions, New Boston was going to be a neighbor. A neighbor I wanted to have good relations with. It was doubtful we'd ever be cheery with the Empire. After killing so many, along with a baron, along with standing against them in war, Zuri might forgive, but I wasn't sure the rest would. Plus, the faction wasn't quite as monolithic as Frostheim. That's all well and good. Better than expected, honestly. But we haven't gotten to how much you're going to take, she said, looking up from the contact. I cleared my throat, drawing attention away from Abigail. All crops harvested after feeding the city will be taxed at 50%. She winced, and I understood. Half was a lot, but we weren't getting any from Montreal. The deal with Zuri was that she got all the food, but paid for it in other resources, mainly gold and dungeon drops. 10% tax on all sales, which was more reasonable. New Boston already had higher tax rates than we did, so if she kept to her standard, our portion would be less than half. 20% of everything pulled out of the dungeon, preferably in skill shards, but will accept coin as well. The contract incentivized paying in skill shards by increasing their value, but I knew not everyone would be keen on giving them up. Also, the dungeon nearby didn't have an affinity, so I wasn't all that worried about the resources themselves. We got plenty from the dungeons closer to us. And lastly, any water beast cores drawn from the St. Lawrence River. Finished. Altogether, it was hefty but also generous. To make up for the monetary and food draw, other resources like iron, stone, and lumber were barely taxed. Even higher grade things like plants and trees weren't taxed all that high to make up for it. Each of the 3 cities had different things we taxed. We wouldn't be getting any food from Montreal, but made up for it with coin, iron, and stone. Ottawa was more forested, so we drew lumber, plants for potions, and beast cores. The only uniform tax on all 3 was on the dungeons. It was high, but we also didn't need to let them access them. Zuri, especially as her population per dungeon ratio was the worst. Bree hummed softly, so half my food Abigail made to interject, but Bree amended herself. A little under half my food, 1/10 of all sales, 1/5 of all that comes out of the dungeon, and a smattering of everything else. And any water beast cores, Abigail added lightly. She was particular about those. Large ones that came from strong beasts could be used in staves, while smaller ones could be used as magical or alchemical ingredients. They could also be used in enchanting, but I wouldn't be seeing many of them. I tracked her eyes and expressions as she read through the fine print. They darted around looking for any trick or loophole, but I made sure the wording was straightforward. I already had to deal with legalese once in life. I wasn't eager to do so again. She seemed resigned but also pleased. Maybe she expected it to be worse, but at least she didn't seem resentful. "This seems like it will benefit both of us," she said after finishing. "I can have my people start as soon as I say the word." I smiled. Finally, something went smoothly lately. Now all we had to do was figure out what to do next. Chapter 439, Climbing. Chris' point of view. Brienne left shortly after our agreement was made, and I was pleased that everything had gone as smoothly as it had. Sitting through a long, drawn-out negotiation would have just been a hassle. One I had little patience for, but luckily, that hadn't turned out to be the case. We should turn our attention back to what we were talking about before she came in. Abigail broke my good mood at seeing one task accomplished, as she was so wont to do lately. "I understand, Abigail, but I really don't want to rehash the same discussion again and again. I've just about had it." I sighed in defeat. "I understand your reservations, Chris, I really do. But we need to go home," she said sternly. "Continuing this drain of a campaign gets us nowhere. He's not here. The sword isn't here. Why are you so set on continuing?" "I'm not set on it," I said defensively, but a part of me knew it wasn't true. "You are, or we would have left weeks ago. Staying for Brienne to show up wasn't necessary," she shot back. The rest of the occupants in the room were content to watch us duke it out once again. Elliot, Anders, and Sydney, the non-family of the room, didn't have strong opinions on the matter. They had followed me because I had called, but I could tell they wanted to go home. They just didn't want to say it to my face. They would follow my lead, annoying as it was endearing. Hal and Gabriel were mixed on the matter. Gabriel hadn't been there, so he didn't understand my hatred of the sword as the other 2 did. But even they were arguing for returning. "I know, Abigail," I admitted. "But it feels like giving up to turn back now. I set out for the sword, and returning without it feels like failure." It hurt to say out loud, but it needed to be said. I felt like I had failed. It was one of the rare times of late, and it felt no less crushing than all the times previously. "It's not giving up," she said comfortingly. "It's well past time we return home. The men want to see their families again. They want to sleep in their own beds. They want this to be over." None of the Oathbound would say it, but based on the looks I'd seen in the city lately, it was true. Hell, even I felt that way when I wasn't trying to delude myself otherwise. For once, I had to admit that a military campaign hadn't ended in success. Taking my look of resignation as something else, she went on. "Our treasury can't afford much more than this anyway." I started, as this was the first time I was hearing of this. "What do you mean?" "I made sure things would be fine while we were gone. The loss from not having the Oathbound running the dungeons hurt, but not something we couldn't overcome. That was just considering our revenue, not our expenses," she stated. "Things are only getting worse the longer this goes on." What is she talking about? I checked those accounts myself. It may have been some years since doing advanced math, but I had nearly gotten a degree in it. I trusted that what I had calculated was correct. Expenses? What expenses? Yes, the constant train of materials making its way out here costs us, but I had accounted for that. We grew food and relied on the conquered cities for most of our supplies anyway. What could... Oh, realization dawned. Expenses. Bereavement to the families who lost someone. I had kept a running list of every oathbound we lost, but I hadn't been thinking about it beyond that. I hadn't wanted to think about it beyond that. I knew the day would eventually come when I had to, but I had hoped. Yes, those, as Abigail put it, expenses were adding up. We had suffered relatively low losses considering everything, but it wasn't zero. Plus, when the people who swore to me died, I made sure their families were well taken care of. Their stipend was generous, to say the least. Even low losses added up when put in that context. My face soured in understanding. With this extended leave lasting half a year, we are stretching the treasury thin. Without the oathbound in the dungeons, without you in the dungeons, things are tight. Abigail went on. She was talking about me. I hadn't raked in coin from the dungeons in a while. Not since before I went north. There was a brief moment where the oathbound did, when I was healing from my spiritual wound, but I myself hadn't. The hardest thing to do was to admit when a battle was lost. I had lost this one. I knew it before the conversation ever started. I hadn't lost conviction. I still burned with anger, but it had died down enough for me to see reason. Continuing to lash out wouldn't get me anywhere. Continuing to conquer villages and outposts up and down the countryside wouldn't get me anywhere. Fine. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. Bitter and sour. We make for Frostheim then. The 6 faces in the tent were hopeful for the first time in a while. But, I added, I want Killian sending teams to check the east and south anyway. I know Ryan probably isn't there, but I want certainty. He'll check every pylon we haven't. Leon's, Bree's, even Vanessa's. Every nearby pylon that he could have possibly run to. Zuri's too. But maybe we'll be a bit discreet with that one. As I said it, I knew it was the right decision. Frostheim had never felt as far away as it had these last few days, and it felt good to commit to going back. It evened out the bitterness of giving up. The 6 others didn't stay long after the decision was made. They were happy and we were going home. Finally. Austin point of view. Saying he was going home and actually going home were 2 entirely different matters. Tahoe was wonderful, and getting all the way here had been a blast. Seeing new mountains, discovering new sights, and being the first to delve into new dungeons. It had all been some of the most fun he had ever experienced. For the first time in a long time he felt good, content, happy, even if the word had to be used. After his dad died and everyone else and all that had happened, Austin hadn't thought he'd ever feel this way again. He'd smothered it all in casual sex and dreams of exploring. But now he didn't have to anymore. Oh, he still did, but he wasn't doing it to distract himself or drown in other emotions, but because he wanted to. Felt good. Spending days, weeks, months retreading the path home was less so. It didn't help that he kept running into things that aggravated him. The other day he came across some wandering priests or something of the sort. They had ranted and raved about some new god they prayed to. Austin wanted nothing to do with that, so he had avoided them. Next, there was a group of bandits who had tried to steal from him. Then he ran into a wild dungeon break. The experience of going back was so much worse than the novelty of exploring the first time. But I couldn't do this last time. With exploring came power, and with power came strength, new abilities, and new tricks. Tricks he was using now. The wind rushed through his hair and slapped at his face as the trees passed by below. His wings were much more real and tangible than they had been before, and he could use them for much longer, too. Seeing how the trees were getting closer than he liked, he sent a small stream of fire mana out from his wings, heating up the surrounding air. It didn't take long to feel his wings catch the thermal, hauling him higher into the air. That trick he learned from watching an annoying little eagle he had tracked down. He had waited and waited for it to eventually come down, but it just kept flying. It took longer than he cared to admit to learn it was using the warm air to rise and glide, rather than fly under its own power the whole time. Eventually, he caught it and slayed it, but not after an irritating hunt. Its feathers sold well for arrows, and its claws for some alchemy get. The beast core was what he was after, and Austin had used it well. Finding the right blend of fire and light mana to enhance his bloodline was difficult, so whenever he did, he made sure to get it. The Falcon's beast core had been perfect. His bloodline evolution was still a ways off, but it was close. He could feel it. He'd buy the rest when he got back. But the thermal trick had been invaluable after learning it. It made flying so much easier. He could glide and glide as long as he had mana to sustain it. His maneuverability was terrible, but he didn't need that when traveling in a straight line. His treasure sense pinged. He had honed that skill over the months, and he knew to trust it after Chris dismissed him before. They would have found the river heart sooner if he had pushed. This felt different. After evolving his profession and coming to understand it better, he could get a clue about what his skill was feeling, and this one felt cold. Cold was good. It meant something related to frost. Some treasures were useless to him, but this one didn't feel like that. His eyes sharpened as he looked, but he just couldn't pinpoint what his skill was tracking. For some reason, it kept telling him he was close, but nothing he did made it feel like he was getting closer. He flew all over the mountain's foothills to no result. Getting frustrated, he sat down to focus entirely on what he was feeling. West? No. North? No. South? No. East? Not no, but not yes either. How the hell did that make any sense? East was the mountains. There was nothing over there except stone and earth for miles. The only way it could... Oh, underground? Strong no. Whatever it wasn't underground. Austin felt dread starting to pool. That left only a few options, and none of them were good. Finally, he asked what he hoped would be the least. Up. His hopes died as he got confirmation. Looked like he was doing some climbing. It better be worth it. Chapter 440, Put Things in Order. Chris' point of view. When the walls of Frostheim finally came into view, a small weight lifted from my shoulders. Just seeing home after such a long time was enough to lift my spirits. Besides the few days before rushing off for Marcus, or the month I spent healing, I hadn't been home in a long, long time. Too long. Nearly a year. To punctuate the point, a light snow fell from the sky to mark the passing of one season to another. Winter was arriving, and as far north as we were, Frostheim was the first to see it. Soon, its beautiful white would spread south. But for now, we were singular in enjoying its bounty. I pulled the reins and halted just to take in the view for a second longer before pushing on towards home. The army marched all the more quickly once their destination was in sight. Abigail had already ridden ahead with her contingent of helpers and aides. She was fussing over getting everything in order, and I wasn't about to stop her from saving me work. There would be enough of that for a lifetime. Just thinking about the mountain of paperwork that awaited me made me shiver in despair. But for one of the first times, the threat of it wasn't all-consuming. A part of me was happy that I would have something to do. My mind and hands would be occupied by the mundane for a while, and weren't going to be further stained red. Even though the work was dreadfully boring, it was something to do other than killing. Plus, my smithy awaited me. The long travel times and extended sieges had given me more than enough time to contemplate my craft. Most of it was theory, as I didn't have the equipment for any heavy forging, but I was ready to get at testing my ideas, especially after how well it went in Ottawa. Not only that, but I had wilder ideas that may just make my weapon of choice all the more powerful. After Frostbound Hammer had been relegated to Epic, I had spent countless nights wondering how to raise it back up to Legendary. None had worked so far, but I was hopeful about where my idea would lead. Runes along the shaft weren't the only place they could be carved, after all. While the view of home helped, it was seeing the people that did the most to raise my mood. The citizens milling the fields for the last crop of the season. The kids running about without a care in the world. The guards sweep along freshly shoveled roads and along the walls. While home would forever be a joyous sight, the people were what made it so. Passing under the outer gates, I felt the energy thrumming inside the stone resonate with my own. The wound from the sword was getting smaller and smaller, and soon, the tear would be nothing but an old memory. I wasn't even sure if a scar would be left behind. No one knew much about spirit wounds, and this was the first time I'd experienced one. Based on the fact that physical scars could be healed away, I assumed this one could too, but assumptions had a saying for a reason. If it did, it did. If it didn't, it didn't. I was just glad I felt my strength returning to me. Every day, I felt more and more like I had before. Some days I felt even better than that. I had hoped that during the multiple battles, I'd find the chance to expand it, but while there had been flashes, nothing stood out decisively. It was a pity, not to mention monumentally frustrating. But that step was still out of reach. Not for long, though, if I had any say in the matter. Based on the speed, slow as it was, the tear was healing. It wouldn't be long until the wound would close for good. Then, with a full and hale spirit, I would try again. Maybe if this winter were peaceful, I could spend it trying to speed up its mending. Winter had always been helpful to me after my affinity was revealed. Who was to say it couldn't aid in this? I was getting ahead of myself. What ifs and could-bes should be left for later. I had things to do, one of which was staring me in the face as we rode through the streets. People cheered and congratulated our arrival, but I could see their eyes darting around to all the faces they could spot. They were looking, searching for their respective loved one or loved ones. Some found their quarry and lit up with joy, clapping all the harder that they were now reunited. Some were left searching, waiting for the rear guard to funnel through. Some would be left forever, with only sadness to meet them. At the back of our train were the coffins. Those that we could recover, at least. It used to be that magic was the only thing that could wreak merry hell on bodies, but that was beginning to become everything. Sufficient power disparity left the corpse unpresentable. Those were always the hardest to mourn, because I wasn't certain of who I was standing over. Those dark thoughts soured my mood, but I chose to focus on the happy and smiling faces that greeted us. There were far more of those than the other, thank no one. Thank no one. The funerals took until 3 days after our return, where it felt like I did little else except watch people be put to rest or cry. It was the price of calling them to war, and I stood my post for every casualty of my war. Retreating to a mountain of paperwork was joyous compared to another day of such depression. Putting things to order was much better than burying the dead. While tedious, it scratched a certain part of me to set things to rights. Frostheim wasn't all that hard to run to begin with, but with being gone as long as I had, things had still backed up. Abigail was the overseer and steward while I was gone. But there were still things that required the Lord's touch, as she had pointed out. I thought it was dumb, as she was a lord in her own right, with the title to prove it, but appearances and all that. Most of the missives were disputes of one kind or another. Adventuring parties fighting over loot, merchants who tried to cheat the taxes, criminals, and all that. Executing the worst of them was the absolute last thing I wanted to do after the long campaign. But did it I did. Their blood was less weighty than the others. It was different killing scum compared to people who were just defending their home. It was deserved and just, which took the edge off. I still wasn't wholly comfortable with it, and I doubted I ever would be. I saw that as a good thing, as I was truly frightened that one day I could kill without even the slightest remorse. The most intriguing of everything was that Volwyn had requested a meeting. The elf merchant had been content to only meet occasionally, and I had been fine with that, so it was odd that he had gone out of his way to request one. Sophia? I called as I read through his request and waited for her arrival to continue. Do you have any idea what Volwyn wants? It took a second for her to think back as his request had come months ago, but she soon remembers. He had said something about finally getting what was requested of him, but that wasn't everything. There was another reason he wanted to meet, but he wouldn't say. I had an idea of what he meant in the first part, but not a clue about the second. The only thing I hadn't already gotten from him was the mental defense techniques, as he had needed to get permission to hand them out, which had inevitably delayed things. Being a new, unknown faction in the wider universe had delayed things further, but it was better late than never in my opinion. Getting it for Erank had been relatively simple. It was getting it for Derank that had taken so long. I doubt it's a coincidence that approval comes right after my fight with Ryan. We knew little of how he got the sword, but we knew who it was from. Or the faction it was from. The Lord of Light, or whatever nonsense title the bastard wanted to go by. Getting permission from the undead, who just so happened to be enemies with the Light guy, after I had just fought someone wielding a sword from him. No, I doubted it was purely coincidence. Tell him I'll meet him tomorrow at 9 a.m., I said. It would give me time to get back into running the dungeons while giving me time to get through the rest of the work. I highly doubted I would get any sleep tonight anyway. I turned out to be right, as work took me late into the night and nearly until sunrise. I had gotten through a large portion of what was needed of me, but by the time the dungeons called, there was still more to be done. Both trips took longer than usual, as my time away had seen the dungeons change. Lucille had detailed the changes, but it was much different to experience it for myself. With the rising mana density of the planet, along with a more than healthy appetite for mana crystals, both dungeons had reached over 15 floors already. The closer one, was at 16 floors deep, while the further one was at 15. Population centers were areas of great mana exchanges. At times, people released more than they took in, while at others, they took in more than they released. Also, it was where the mana crystals were stored, along with other mana-heavy resources. All in all, the flow of mana around the city was turbulent, which caused the dungeon closer to the city to catch more in its range. Lucille had detailed the ranges and average draw of both dungeons somewhere, but I wasn't that interested in finding it. Knowing they were growing well was enough for me. The nitty-gritty details could be left for her, who delighted in it way more than she should. The delves were a nice break from the paperwork, while also being much more challenging than I expected. After the many levels I'd gained, I'd assumed delving would be a cakewalk, but that was far from the truth. Level 160 monsters weren't anything to scoff at. Floor bosses at that. Having a full weight of the Arctic behind me was one of the sole reasons I could punch that high at all. If my spirit had still been completely broken, I wouldn't have won either. Maybe it's time to look at a pylon upgrade? What level is the boss predicted to be for Count? End of chapter 440.